Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on tackling Louping Ill. I'm really pleased that the NSA and Moredun Institute be able to bring this webinar to you today. But I also really want to recognise the role that many others have played in getting us to a point where we've now got a much better understanding of this disease and of the host as well, and to a point where we've got a new vaccine, a Louping Ill vaccine in development. People that have been involved in getting us this far include many farmers and their vets who have shared their experiences with us over the last period of time, APHA and some of the veterinary investigation centres, and in particular, joining us today, Liverpool University and the Dartmoor Hill Farm Project, both of whom who have done significant work on this topic. So we're here talking about Louping Ill in particular. Louping Ill is one of a number of tick-borne diseases. And as with many sheep diseases, we aren't just talking about the disease itself, but we're also talking about the host, the life cycle of the host, tick in this case, and the factors that are affecting tick populations. Many of the issues around Louping Ill relate to our upland environments, and these are areas where multifunctionality expectations are really at their highest. These environments are valued and expected to deliver on water, on soil, on nature, on carbon, people and well-being, and of course for farming. But there are always trade-offs that need management. And in this situation, when we're looking at changing our environments, making more nature-rich habitats in the uplands, that's often related to an increase in tick populations and then the need to control diseases that might emanate from those ticks. Sheep farming may well be expected to be multifunctional, but it also has to be productive and it has to be viable. And optimizing sheep health in the upland areas is very much based on reducing our losses. Health of sheep is a key component of productivity in all of our grassland areas and our uplands in particular. We are seeing habitats change in relation to agri-environment schemes and changes in expectations and land management. And because of that, tick populations are changing. New disease challenges emerge, and the potential for a new novel vaccine that will help us overcome this problem is now well underway, but it needs further investment and further development. We've got a great panel of speakers here today who are going to outline some of the issues and the solutions as well. We've got Duncan Millar, who's a farmer up in Scotland, who's going to be talking about his experience of Louping Ill. We've got Caroline Millins from Liverpool University, who has been leading an extensive research project, the OPTIC project, on the risks of tick-borne diseases in changing upland environments. We've got David Attwell from the Dartmoor Hill Farm Partnership, who leads that network, that partnership down on Dartmoor, and he's going to be talking about their experiences of Louping Ill down on Dartmoor and some of the work that they've been doing to try to overcome these problems. And then finally, Beth Wells from the Moredun Institute, who's going to be talking about progress with and some of the hurdles around overcoming bringing a new Louping Ill vaccine to market. The way we're going to deliver this webinar this morning is that each speaker is going to have somewhere in the region of 12 to 15 minutes, and then that should leave us 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. The webinar will be online by the end of the day, so for those people that want to catch up again and look at the presentations, or for those that have missed the webinar, it will be available via the NSA website and through the Moredun website as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, is Duncan Millar, a farmer from Scotland. Ian.
Thanks, Phil. My experience was quite shattering, actually. I wasn't really expecting life to be as difficult as it was. So perhaps my tale is one of caution that this disease can strike when perhaps least you expect it. What happened in my case was in October 2023, I moved a big bulk of my ewes onto pasture, which I thought was nice and green and ready to flush ewes. And it had been saved for that purpose since July. So it was nice and green and lush. And I put the sheep on there. 14 days later, I went to the gate and, oh, there's a dead one and there's another one. And very quickly, I counted up to about 70 out of about just under 400. So that was the pretty bald statistics that led me to find a way around this problem. I'd been grazing that ground for about 3.5 years previously with no obvious problems. So why it suddenly struck in October, I still to this day don't quite know. But at least we were able, through post-mortem with SAC and through discussion with Beth and her colleagues at Moredun, to work out exactly what it was and what the solutions were. And we were able to put in place the various solutions. And we're now managing, because we know what we're dealing with, we're managing it with porons. So what turned out to be a big capital loss in the first instance, I think the loss for the business is probably somewhere in the region of 25 grand. And we're now got an ongoing cost of probably a couple of pound a ewe in porons for the season, something of that order. But at least now we know what we're dealing with, and we can deal with it. And since then, we have managed to graze that ground without any real ill effect. The porons work, they undoubtedly do work. But my question that hangs in the air for me, and I don't know the answer yet, is the porons are killing the tick. What else are they killing? And I think that's a question which we in the uplands and in sheep industry in general really need to get to grips with. And how much better would it be if we can utilize the immune system of the sheep rather than the chemistry from a laboratory to control this particular disease? At the end of the day, I am running a business like all of us, and it's got to be profitable. And at the moment, using porons and adding that extra cost is within a profitable business, and it is working. But I would be far happier if we could run that business without the question mark about the environmental damage that we're possibly doing. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale. I wasn't expecting to be hit by Louping Ill, but having been hit, it's been quite interesting to understand exactly how it goes. And I think over the next half an hour or so, we'll hear a bit more about the detail of it. So yes, it's a cautionary tale, and we've lived to tell this tale. It's not the end of the world for us, but it has been a bit of a bump in the road. And hopefully others can maybe learn from it, and maybe we see how important it is that we get a vaccine sooner rather than later. I think, Phil, I would stop at that and maybe let others go on to some of the detail.
Thanks, Ian. That's great. And a really sobering tale there in terms of the impact on your business, but also that cautionary note as well about just considering the wider environmental impact of some of the preventative products that we're using. These are essential products and people are using them quite widely, but you're quite right as well that the more we can do to either stimulate the sheep's own immune system, or to step in and to initiate that immune response through a vaccine, environmentally that's got to be more beneficial. So it's a really good message to start us off, Ian. Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to move on now to Caroline Millins from the university, who's been working on a project called the Optic Project, which is really looking at habitat change and tick populations, and the prevalence of disease within ticks as well. It's a fascinating piece of work, and in a way it underpins much of what we need to know about assessing the risk. So Caroline, over to you.
Thanks very much, Phil. Can I just check before I go on that the slides are displaying okay?
They look to be displaying fine.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Yep. Thanks very much. So good afternoon. I'm Caroline Millins. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool in veterinary epidemiology, and I'm going to be presenting research to understand how environmental change and particularly land use is affecting risk from ticks that we've been carrying out as part of the Optic project. And this is DEFRA and BBSRC funded project. It's interdisciplinary, involving the University of Liverpool, but also partners with the UKHSA, APHA and UKCEH. So my role in this project is leading empirical research, and Phil mentioned we've been working in the uplands in Wales, and I'll get on to describe some of that research and results in a few slides' time. But just as some background, why this research project and why now? Well, we know that there's an increasing burden from diseases linked to ixodes in the UK, but also more widely within Europe. And this is affecting livestock health, but also human health. So our key diseases in livestock we'd associate with this tick are louping ill, but also other diseases. Such as tick-borne fever and tick piemia and redwater in cattle, all spread by the same tick vector. And also, this tick vector spreads the bacteria which causes Lyme disease. We know that Lyme disease cases have increased tenfold since 2000. And tick-borne encephalitis, there's been a westward spread and emergence of tick-borne encephalitis in new areas of Europe, including the UK, since 2019. And we wanted to know, are these changes driven by changes in climate, policy and land use, changes in deer and wildlife populations, or a combination of all of these factors? So our overarching research question is how land use and policy will affect tick, livestock and wildlife populations and alter patterns in tick-borne disease risk. We want to know which areas, land uses, livestock management practices carry the highest risks for tick-borne diseases now and in the future, and which farm management practices and biodiversity policies will minimise these risks most effectively. So the empirical work where we've been going out onto farms and collecting data is being carried out in 2 study landscapes in optic. The one that I'm going to focus on today is in the work we've done in North Wales in upland environments. And why did we pick North Wales? That's because it's a tick-borne disease hotspot based on the APHA post-mortem surveillance. There's also a high uptake of environmental policies, such as Glass-Steer, which are changing the way that upland habitats are being managed. We recruited 20 hill farms. All of these farms had over 100 breeding ewes, and the main purpose of these sheep flocks was upland flocks that were being grazed in the uplands and on rough grazing. So a quick recap of the tick life cycle here. You can see on the right-hand side here that there are 3 different life stages. The larvae, the smallest one, almost invisible, the nymph, which is around the size of a poppy seed, and then the adults, which people are usually most familiar with from biting their animals. You'll see the engorged ones quite often on sheep and dogs. And on the left-hand side, you can see the relative scale of these different life stages and the big, juicy adult female engorged sort of grape-sized tick that you'll see. And the adult female takes this blood meal in order to be able to produce an egg batch that will complete the tick life cycle. The adult ticks require a large host, such as a deer or a sheep. Tick populations are much reduced or absent where there are no suitable large hosts to support the tick populations. And immature tick stages tend to feed on smaller hosts, such as rodents and birds. And we know that there's differences in suitability of different habitats for this tick species. It spends most of the life cycle in the environment. Habitats such as woodland, where there's a deep leaf litter layer for the tick to spend much of that life cycle off the host, are particularly suitable because they buffer the changes in environmental temperature and conditions that can be less suitable and reduce survival. But we know that the tick can also survive in less suitable areas such as rough grasslands and moorlands, causing problems for livestock farmers in those habitats as well. And just on the bottom left panel, just to highlight that this tick vector is seasonally active. The peak seasonal activity, usually during the spring and summer. You can get a second peak in some areas of the UK in the autumn. And we are seeing changes from that standard seasonal pattern with changes in weather and increasing reports of disease in livestock linked to unusual winter activity of ticks. And even in the study in Wales, some farmers were saying that the ticks are just active all year round, and that was creating additional problems with control for them. So this slide is to recap the sheep tick-borne diseases of concern. There should be two maps here. The second one isn't displaying for some reason, but the left-hand panel shows the Louping Ill virus diagnoses made from post-mortem surveillance. And you can see the distribution of numbers of diagnoses in the different colouring of the different areas there. So red is a higher number of cases. And this isn't standardised by submissions or numbers of sheep. This is just the raw data from a published paper. Anaplasma diagnoses mirror that pattern to a lot greater or larger extent. We know that Louping Ill virus can cause neurological symptoms and death in sheep, and disease and losses can be more severe when animals are also infected with anaplasma, another pathogen that's transmitted by the same tick vector. So tick-borne fever and tick pyemia is caused by Anaplasma phagocytophilum, the bacteria that I just mentioned. It infects neutrophils, a white blood cell in the sheep, causing immunosuppression. In the preliminary infection, it can cause fever and production losses, and also immunosuppression, leading to increased susceptibility to secondary infections, including Louping Ill. So in this research project, we had certain predictions that we based on our pre-existing knowledge of the habitat suitability for this tick species, and knowledge of how land use is changing in the upland environments. So we wanted to know how landscape structure and management is altering patterns in tick-borne disease risk. And the reason for this is so we can develop recommendations and mitigations to reduce those risks. So we thought that tick density would increase with the proximity and proportion of suitable habitats, such as woodland and rough grazing. And we also thought that the amount of infection in livestock would increase with the amount of suitable habitat on a particular farm, so the amount of woodland cover and the proportion of rough grazing. And this is relevant to many of the agri-environmental schemes which are promoting increases in woodland planting and stocking rate reductions, which are changing the structure and complexity of vegetation. We made some predictions around the improved in biofields, that ecotonal, so the habitat bordering transitions between different habitats, so woodland to pasture or along hedgerows, and scrub habitats will have the highest tick density, because we know that that is areas where there are higher numbers of wildlife hosts, but also more suitable conditions for the ticks to survive. And this is important because these habitats are often considered, these in-by improved fields, often considered low risk, and preventative strategies are often different for animals that are grazed in those areas compared to some of the rougher pastures. And we also made some predictions around environmental and farm management practices and how that would affect tick density. So I won't go into this in much detail, but we went out to the farms 3 times to collect farm management information, to collect the ticks in the springtime across a range of different field types, and then in the autumn to take blood samples from healthy lambs and yearling replacements. And then we tested all of the ticks and blood samples in the lab. So what did we find? we found that hill habitats had the highest tick density amongst all of the different habitats that we sampled. And this was also viewed by farmers as having the highest risk, and was often targeted for management options such as stocking reductions and input restrictions. And just to say from the study, this was a cross-sectional study, so we can't make any judgments about how tick risk is changing over time. We can just make comparisons between different habitat types. Just draw your attention to the numbers of ticks that we're finding. They were within the ranges that have been found in similar studies in Wales, where they've gone at tick collecting from the environment, but relatively low compared to other studies in woodland, where we typically find around 5 to 10 times as many ticks. So this is around 1 tick every 50 meters. We would find usually a tick every 10 meters in woodland, for example. But there is something particular about Wales that was interesting to us, that you see the grazed woodland and the ungrazed woodland is just hidden under the panel, the zoom panel there. Very low tick densities, and that is in contrast to what we find in other areas of the country, such as the southwest. And I'll come back to that if I have time. So what did we find when we looked at factors that were driving tick density? Well, we found that the proportion of rough grazing in the surrounding area drove tick density in upland habitats in Wales. Interestingly, we found that woodland proximity didn't increase tick density. And as I just mentioned, this was different to what we find in the southwest, where we find that the amount of woodland surrounding a pasture is a really important driver of the numbers of ticks on that pasture. And the difference, we think, is differences in wildlife populations. So in Wales, and at least in the farms that we studied in the area that we were in, there were very low deer numbers, whereas in the southwest there's very high deer populations, and woodlands on and around farmlands typically have roe deer populations, and these woodlands are acting as points for spillover of ticks onto the nearby pasture. When we looked at the improved in-by fields, considered low risk by the farmers and often managed differently with more susceptible stock grazed on these fields, we found lower tick density, but not an absence of ticks. So the ticks that were present were found near the boundaries, near the hedgerows, and this is important for management. Farmers were reporting disease linked to the improved in-by fields in the study. And just to mention, we weren't setting out to particularly measure tick infestations on sheep. So this was a byproduct of when we were blood sampling animals. For welfare and logistical reasons, we didn't think it was fair to ask the farmers not to treat prior to our visits for the blood sampling, and farmers had treated with different products and at variable intervals. So this isn't robust data, but just as a comment from the sampling, we were seeing some animals with very, very high tick infestations, over 100 adult females per sheep, usually animals that hadn't been treated with a product in the previous few weeks. And just the effect of the blood loss from that amount of tick infestation, with the pathogen transmission aside, that could be really significant. You're looking at around 1/4 to 1/3 of a ml of blood that can be ingested by one of these adult female ticks. And then the results of our blood sampling. So I'm just having a little bit of a issue with the slides not displaying properly here. So unfortunately, the plots aren't displaying. But we found very, very high infection and exposure rates to tick-borne pathogens on these farms. So the bacteria that I mentioned that causes immunosuppression, we found that on 100% of the farms. And just a reminder, these were all clinically healthy animals. And this was in the lambs and also in the yearlings. On average, 75% of the animals tested were PCR positive for anaplasma. When we looked at Louping Ill virus exposure, we just looked at the yearlings in each of these farms because the lambs would have still had maternally derived immunity. The yearlings are typically being grazed on the hill fields. We found an exposure of 55% of farms had been exposed, was showing exposure to Louping Ill virus. And sorry, you can't see the plots here, but 6 of the farms had an exposure rate of over 10%, which Moredun suggest is high risk. So our next steps are to understand what this means in terms of impacts and economic impacts. So we're approaching this in a number of different ways. Does the exposure that we're recording in these farms in the previous slide mean protection? These animals have got high levels of immunity and they're protected. Or is it an indicator that there's serious disease issues going on that may be undetected? So we're approaching this through farm performance investigations using the Global Burden of Animal Diseases methodology. APHA are kindly offering free post-mortem surveillance that we're using to investigate losses of suspected tick-borne disease. And this has revealed some really interesting and I think reveal tick-borne disease issues that the farmers had previously not been aware of through the post-mortems. And then also syndromic surveillance, where we ask the farmers to report cases of tick-borne diseases that have a certain clinical presentation. And then the next steps, we're looking to understand the effects of environmental management practices on tick risk, understand the economic and animal health impacts, work together with farmers and vets who participated in the study to develop effective and tailored tick management practices. And we've also got a policy engagement strand wherein we're engaging with policymakers to help develop balanced animal health and welfare and environmental policies. That's the end of my presentation. I'd just like to thank everybody who was involved in the study.
Thank you, Caroline. That was excellent, and it's so important, isn't it, to understand the environmental factors behind, the host of what can be a really debilitating disease. So thank you very much for that. It's really useful work. We're going to pass on or move on now to David Attwell. David manages the Dartmoor Hill Farm Project, and I know a lot of your members, David, have been severely impacted by Louping Ill over these last few seasons. I know this is an area you've been really active on as well. So, over to you for a few moments.
Great, thank you. I'll just see if I can get the technology to work. Can you see the screen, Phil?
You can see it, but it's not on presentation mode. If you could just find a way to expand that would be great. And while you're doing that, if I can just ask people to, if you've got questions, please post them in the Q&A facility at the bottom bar on the screen, and we'll come to those to deal with those questions later on.
I'm not quite sure how I do that. I don't know whether your colleague can do
Katie,
that.
can you bring it up, Katie? Yeah. Hold on.
I can do. Yeah, just bear with me.
Excellent. Thank you. And if you can just indicate when you want the slides to move forward when they come up, David, that'd be great.
Great, thanks, Phil. Sorry about that technical.
Don't worry. These technical challenges are here to challenge us, aren't they? Really. So.
Yeah, indeed. Great.
Does that look okay?
That's great. Thank you very much, Katie. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the things that we've been doing on Dartmoor in relation to one particular project, and then talk more generally about tick and tick-borne disease within an upland landscape. The summary at the top, turds, nerds, flocks and herds, was one of our farmers who came up with our WhatsApp group. And I think that sort of perfectly encapsulates a lot of the work we've been doing. So, Katie, if you could go to the next slide, please.
I am trying to move on, although it won't actually allow me to move on for some reason at the moment. Just bear with me.
Okay.
Is it? It's not moving on for anybody now.
It's not moving on at the moment. No. No.
Here we are. Is that
That's
worked
it.
now?
Well done. Well done. Great.
There we go.
Okay, so the Hill Farm Project is based on Dartmoor. We're there to try and support and champion farming in the environment. And I wanted to say particular thanks to Harford and Loughborough Commons Association and Holmore Commons Associations and the landowners involved for this piece of work, and particularly to Anne Wilcox, who was instrumental in helping delivering the project, which has just disappeared now. We've got skipping land, so I'll keep going. And also to Neil Cole, who's been helping with some of the wider tick-based work. So if you don't know Dartmoor, we're in the southwest of England. It's an upland landscape, about 360 square miles, more typical maybe of a sort of a northern upland, but because of its position, slightly more oceanic environment. Caroline was talking a bit about ticks being present, for 11 months of the year. That certainly, I think, will be the case now on Dartmoor. Most of the farms are traditional sort of upland beef and sheep units. And in terms of grazing, then they graze the commons as well. Probably of the land area, I would say something in the region of 45% would be semi-natural vegetation, so ideal sort of tick country. Katie, I don't know if we can move to the next slide. There's a taskbar in the middle, but I don't know whether that could be minimised.
Apologies. Is that better?
Okay, that's okay. Yeah, thank you. So the journey to do with ticks actually started off with dung, rather surprisingly, because we were doing a project looking at dung beetles, and the reason for that is I think in the emerging marketplaces for things like blended finance and natural capitals, I was interested in how do we bring more money into commoning, and particularly for graziers. And if you look at the role of a grazier on a common, then there's a right to obviously take forage by the mouths of livestock, but most of the other interests lie with the landowner, particularly some of the natural capitals in the soil. But we felt dung was an opportunity because it falls out the back of our animals, and then it drives a whole ecosystems of different things on the common. And what we did is we worked with a local entomologist, Clive Turner, and we looked at a gold standard common where we knew that the dung beetle population was really good. And then we looked at 10 in-by farms and 2 other commons. And the chart on the left is a really interesting one. It's a very positive story for sheep, really, because what it shows is in terms of bioabundance. If you get that right in perfect conditions, there's over sort of 360 odd dung beetles per litre of dung. Ponies are roughly half that, and cattle have something like 6 dung beetles per litre of dung. So it's a really, really good, interesting story, and it links a bit to what Ian was saying about how do we know, what are the impacts of things like borons and acaricides. And then the right-hand table says a little bit about if you like, specificity. So dung beetles were thought to be generalists, but I think our work showed that actually they will quite often select species of dung, and there were 16 species of dung beetle that were very heavily focused on sheep dung. So when we were doing this work, we were also looking at the vet med records for all participating farms to understand what products we were using. And in those discussions with the farmers, it became very obvious that actually ticks and tick-borne disease was the prime driver for using these products. And many of these farms had used the Louping Ill vaccine in the past, and obviously that vaccine had lapsed. And because of concerns about losses on the common, people were taking a very precautionary approach, and rightly so. So ticks came into sort of our focus. Could I have the next slide, please? So we set out to look in a bit more detail. We're also doing a lot of work around mineral deficiencies, and we knew from bloods that we'd taken and soil work and forage that cobalt was very, very deficient in our lambs. And we had a feeling that the lambs were being challenged on the common, and particularly with tick-borne disease and maybe secondary challenges. And we wanted to see if long-acting vitamin B12 injections would help to not only provide more resilience for those lambs, but also improve their productivity. So we decided to use a B12 injection, and at the same time that provided an opportunity to handle the sheep more frequently, and also then to do blood testing and to look at ticks. And we ran a sort of a sister project at the same time, which was extending the dung beetle work, where we used 4 common porons, 3 porons and 1 full immersion dip, to evaluate what was going on in the dung at 4, 8 and 12 weeks after treatment, so we could understand a bit more about that relationship between using the product to reduce tick burdens, but also what was happening to dung fauna. If you could move on, Katie, please. I mentioned that we're able to handle sheep more regularly. One of the challenges, I think, with doing these sort of farmer-led trials is access to sheep. And in common systems, obviously, once they've gone out the gate, they're probably coming back again until shearing or clipping time. Because of the way we ran the project, we were able to work quite closely with the graziers, and then we were bringing sheep in onto fields adjacent to the common to allow us to have access at those sheep at particular periods of time. So that worked really well, and that allowed us to do the data collection that I was referring to. All of the blood samples went up to Mary Rocci in the Moredun Institute in Edinburgh for analysis. So that gave us a really clear idea of what was happening on the ground. Katie, could you move to the next slide, please? So what did that tell us, really? So in terms of the bloods that we took, we had on each farm, we had 2 groups, really. So we'd have 50 lambs that were in the treated group, and we'd have 50 lambs that were in a non-treated group. They were all EID tagged so we could identify them. So we took 18 blood samples on each farm, 9 from each of the groups. 5 were looking at the tick-borne disease side, so Louping Ill, anaplasma. And then we looked at a full mineral analysis and B12 as well. And then we had a number of sheep. We just looked at B12 on its own. Tick-borne fever, I should say, is a pool of 5 bloods. So all of the Louping Ill work we were doing, we were looking at individual sheep. When you come to tick-borne fever, what we were doing is we were combining the bloods into a group. So rather than an individual assessment, it was a group result, really. And then the other thing we did, very similar to Caroline, is that because we had these lambs there, we were turning them over and we were counting the number of ticks really from the chin of the sheep all the way down to the crotch. And we had a sort of a simplistic methodology, a time count effectively, and we were looking for nymphs and adults during that period. Katie, if we could have the next slide, please. So what did the results tell us? Well, interestingly, just having seen Caroline's results, ours were probably slightly lower. So I think in the first phase of testing, we were seeing on the farms that had positive results, about 7% of our lambs were coming back with antibodies to show that they had been impacted by Louping Ill, or being challenged, I should say. And then when we repeated that in our second phase, so a total of 170 blood tests for Louping Ill across our 469 lambs, we saw something like just under 5% of the sheep in the group had been impacted by Louping Ill. I think one of the things it got me thinking about is the specificity of where the disease can be within the landscape. So you tend to look at a common and you may think, well, it's a widespread problem, but we could see particular what we would call leers or hefts in other part of the country, particular areas where we had that disease prevalence. And we also went out and we did blanket tick dragging in those areas to see if we could pick up the disease in live ticks, which is slightly harder to do based on numbers. In terms of tick-borne fever, anaplasma, then very similar to the Welsh results, every flock had anaplasma at very high levels. When we looked at the results, the CT results, they were really, really high, and that was repeated in both phases of testing. And we had one farmer who we included in our pool because he only had a small flock of in-by sheep. He was actually just outside the national park, the home farm. And again, we picked up very high levels of anaplasma within his sheep as well. Next slide, please, Katie. In terms of turning sheep over and looking at ticks, it was a very funny year, 2024. It was very wet. It was quite cold early on. and we had very few ticks actually on the sheep, interestingly. But by the time we repeated that later in the year, we were picking up 80 to 90 ticks per lamb. And those lambs had been treated. So this is when we were bringing sheep in for shearing. So they had been treated with one or other ectoparasite treatment early in the season. And you can see the active ingredients are listed there. I haven't named the products, but these would all be all products that people on the call would be using. As Caroline said, I think it wasn't scientific enough. We didn't have a big enough sample to draw any conclusions. But it was interesting to see that difference, if you like, in the numbers of ticks between the spring and the autumn. Next slide, please. So what have we learnt? Well, I think it got us as a group really looking at what we were doing. And some of this, I think, is basic good flock management. So certainly thinking about that period pre and post lambing in terms of colostrum, there are antibodies passed from the ewe to the lamb. So actually making sure that we had good levels of colostrum, giving that lamb the best chance to pick up those antibodies. And obviously, in an ideal world, what you want is you want that lamb to be challenged with Louping Ill while it's getting those antibodies from the mother. And I think what we see quite often is maybe later in the season, and I think there's something here about the mobility of stock later in the autumn, that if they do come into contact with Louping Ill, particularly if they've got anaplasma already, which clearly all these sheep seem to be having, then they were likely to fall over at that particular point. The combination of the two things, I think, is really, really interesting. And we certainly know that, there is a relationship. So if you've got anaplasma and Louping Ill, then it's going to create more problems. So understanding that, I think we found really helpful. And then the thing about stress being a factor to induce a reaction, and our farmers and graziers certainly feel that is important, particularly in the autumn when we're driving sheep off the common, and we're then probably doing multiple tasks. We're probably shearing or dosing and sorting and then weaning. And 8 to 12 days after that activity, we're seeing lambs falling over in the fields, really. So maybe thinking a little bit more about how we manage that. The black losses is really interesting, and I think we're really poor at doing this, and this is why we need more data so that we understand what are the true costs of managing stock within these spaces. So we were seeing 20% of the lambs in our pilot didn't come back. So that's a significant number, and financially, particularly at lamb values this year, that's really important. So what are those black losses? How many of them can we attribute to either directly to tick-borne disease or to secondary challenge related to tick-borne disease? And things like tick pyemia, if you've got anaplasma, probably 30% of your lambs, there's potential that you could get tick pyemia, which is debilitating as well. Agri-environment schemes and the impact. I think this is really interesting, and this is something that's very noticeable, I think, on Dartmoor. Probably been in schemes for 30 years, maybe since the ESA days. And obviously, in terms of livestock reduction, then those reductions have been significant. And what we're seeing is changes, quite considerable changes in vegetation loading and in vegetation communities, creating really good conditions for ticks. And I think when you bring in climate change, our position in the far southwest, much milder winters, then it's understandable that we're going to have more ticks present. Stocking calendars linked to agri-environment schemes are really important. So actually breaking that cycle of natural resilience built up in flocks over a long period of time, going to summer grazing without a vaccine, really, really challenging. And what we've seen is graziers actually giving up because they just can't stand those losses caused by Louping Ill. So that's important. Vacuums on commons. So if you change the grazing structure, the natural layering structure, you take a flock or a herd out or someone drops out, animals will move. And we've certainly seen some good examples on Dartmoor where animals that were higher up the hill, if you like, that were grazing areas where the tick disease was much less. Naturally, as a flock has moved out and the grass is sweeter, they've come down the hill and then they've come into contact with ticks that are carrying that disease, and we've seen significant losses. So the displacement of livestock caused by some of these things is really important. Swaling. I think if you want to know about ticks, talk to shearers, because they're the ones that are handling the sheep at the peak time of year. And they will often say to me that they like sooty sheep or black sheep, because those are the sheep that have been grazed the swaled areas. And those areas are probably cleaner, we feel, in terms of ticks and tick burden. So the breakdown in some of those traditional management cycles, what contribution is that having to tick populations? And then I think the way we deal with things like SFI as an example, that's done through individual farm businesses. There's no collective model for SFI on commons so that you can come together, as we've done with this piece of work, to discuss those issues. We've talked about climate change. I'm not going to go on about deer populations, but I think deer populations have been significant in moving ticks around Dartmoor. And we've touched a little bit on the environmental impact of the caricide treatments. Without the vaccine, what are we going to do? I have real fears that probably we'll find that some of these products will have a shelf life. And if we haven't got these products, then it's very difficult to graze these landscapes, really. The other thing we've been doing is we've been looking much wider outside of this particular project in the landscape on Dartmoor. We've been doing a lot of work with Dr. Ben Jones from AFA, a lot of tick dragging, a lot of understanding about what densities have we got, and then taking ticks away and getting them analysed in detail, particularly for human health as well. And I think there's a direct relationship between the activity that we deploy within these landscapes and how people use them. And Caroline was saying about the increase of human health issues, particularly Lyme's disease. That's definitely a factor here on Dartmoor. And I think we need to take a much more One Health approach in the way that we look at ticks, because clearly there is a zoonotic element here as well, which we need to be understanding and dealing with. And I did quite a few case studies for Beth for the Moredun campaign for the vaccine. And what that showed me is how the disease or the virus has spread right the way around Dartmoor, really, and the financial impact that that's having. And not just sheep, sheep are probably 80% of the losses, but then cattle, hill ponies, quality ponies, dogs, sheepdogs, all of these factors, when you add them up, are very significant. Sorry, next slide, please. So just to finish off, really, where are we going next? Well, I'm really pleased to say, actually, we've been working quite hard with UKHSA and with AFA to put a bid into DEFRA, which has just been successful. And that's to try and look in detail at an upland landscape, to look at what's going on Dartmoor, and hopefully to come up with a longer term surveillance model so we can understand the problems we have, where the disease is, and I hope build up a really good idea around some of the issues that we need to do more on, things like black losses, getting agri-environment payments to the place they need to be, looking at how we integrate sort of land management for multiple uses, and trying to get some common sense really into the whole discussion around grazing semi-natural areas, and putting animal health and welfare back into the centre of that discussion if we can. I'm really pleased to say that we included 450,000 for the development of the Louping Ill vaccine for Moredun, and that's been successful. So I'm hoping that will enable Beth to move forward the development of the vaccine to the first phase. We're going to be doing further blood testing on farms. So if anyone's on the call from Dartmoor, and if I haven't been in contact with you, do get in contact with me. I'm very interested to talk to you about how we can involve you. And we're going to be doing human health screening as well. So I'm going to be looking at rural workers, farmers, the community, to try and understand how many people have been exposed to Lyme's disease, as an example. And all of that work, I hope, will feed into Phil and some of the things that are going on with the Dartmoor land use management. So the last slide, please. So that's just a very quick summary of what we're trying to achieve with the next round of funding. And I think that's the end of my talk. So thank you very much. Thank you, Katie, for dealing with the slides.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And it's so good to hear, so much detailed and in-depth work going on down there. So thank you very much for that. Let's move on quickly now to Beth Wells. Beth Wells is from the Moredun Institute, and she's going to really give us an update on the development of a new Louping Ill vaccine that they've been working on for some time. Beth, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. Hopefully everybody can see this okay and hear me all right.
Yeah, that's fine. It's not on full presentation mode, but it is now, actually. I was going to suggest it may be safer to leave it like that, but that looks okay.
We'll see. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're still hanging in there. I'm going to give you a really quick run through a bit about the disease, a bit about where it's going, what we're seeing on the national scale and surveillance, and more really about the vaccine and the novel commercialisation route that we're being forced down. So a little bit about the disease. I won't say too much about this. It's been covered by lots of others, but I think it's the important thing here is that sheep and red grouse are highly susceptible, so involving the upland industries to quite a large prevalence, really. The clinical disease is really complex, and just very briefly, severity is associated with all of the below. So viral load, so as more ticks become infected with Louping Ill, the animals get more chance of actually developing clinical disease from it. The immune status of the animal is very important. They do get antibodies to Louping Ill if they're hefted sheep. So having your flock hefted is, as David has mentioned, an important part, as is tick-borne fever. So co-infection, we know, is what brings up these large losses you can see with Louping Ill. And stress is undoubtedly a factor as well. So when you're handling sheep and bringing them in, doing treatments, whatever, is a higher risk for actually seeing the disease itself. It is a very extremely nasty disease in whatever species it hits, and we've done most work, obviously, because they are the most likely to get it of all our livestock species. The sheep initially will just look quite depressed. They'll not eat properly, so they'll look fairly anorexic. They have two fever peaks, and the first fever peak is that sort of depression. The second one is all to do with these neurological signs, and you'll see it in this yow. She's a bit uncoordinated, her head's tilted, and that is when the virus has got through the blood-brain barrier and it's now in the brain of the sheep. And generally, what will happen following that is muscle tremors, paralysis, and usually death, although some do get over it. That's very few of them. Good news for lambs, as you see, that yow's got a couple of good lambs with her. They do get protective antibodies from maternal colostrum. The time these last is really variable, as has been shown by studies, because in the upland system, it's really difficult to ascertain that lambs get good enough quality, enough colostrum quickly enough. So again, the importance of maternal colostrum there. It should also be said that although that will protect against Louping Ill virus, it won't protect them from anaplasma. So you have to deal with the two diseases a bit differently. So vaccine history. So very much in the Moredun history, it's one of the first vaccines we ever produced in the 1930s. That was replaced by a new vaccine in the 1960s, sort of using the best technology at the time. But it was a cell culture derived vaccine, which means the manufacturer had to grow up live virus and then kill it and put it in the vaccine. So those of you that can remember using the vaccine, it was a sticky, horrible vaccine to use, particularly if it was cold weather, it got even worse. And it was actually a very difficult and expensive vaccine to manufacture. So suddenly that was withdrawn in 2017. And so we've now had 8 years of no vaccine, and we understand this need, this urgent need for a vaccine to help our upland farmers. But I think we have to go back and look at the surveillance here, because the question we get asked a lot is, well, we do actually need a new vaccine to protect sheep. Can we not just use acariciidal treatments, for example? Well, we've heard a bit about the issues with those, so I won't go into that. But if we look at the surveillance, and the VIDA website is really excellent for this, Louping Ill is a difficult one because it is an upland disease, and generally it is the sheep are never found, they're certainly never tested, or it's a black loss as lambs come in. So the sheep prevalence here doesn't really tell us very much. But what we can do is we can add the red grouse surveillance onto the top of that. And red grouse are actually much easier because obviously they're shot in August. So in areas where there is moorland, we can add that to the sheep map. So in the absence of the vaccine and with the addition of the red grouse data, we can actually see how Louping Ill has spread down the country, north to south generally, west to east, with the spread of tick. Now, I should say these are just case reports for each on a regional basis. So it doesn't mean to say that all of these regions are covered in Louping Ill, because that's absolutely not the case. And I wouldn't like to give that impression. As David said, there are pockets and there are clear pockets as well. Certainly climate and land use changes are favouring tick habitat, as we've heard from Caroline, and also deer populations in some areas for sure are increasing our tick taxing effects. We do know that vaccinating sheep flocks prevents disease not only in the sheep themselves, but it also reduces the viral loading in ticks on hills. So in that way, it can help protect these other species that we're now seeing are being affected. So surveillance is showing us that in cattle, dogs and horses, we're having more cases, particularly in the last 2 years, than we've had previously. And these animals are certainly historically less susceptible to the virus. Now, the vaccine, of course, isn't the be-all and end-all. It's a tool which will enable farmers to prevent louping ill in sheep. There still will be a need for acariciidal treatments, but we really feel that these could be reduced if the pressure for louping ill comes off them. And I think that's really important given the way we're going with acariciidal treatments. So a little bit about the vaccine. This was some really nice work done by Dr. David Griffiths and his team at Moredun. And they had identified, as part of our Scottish Government work, these virus-like particles. And these are this on the bottom here. I'll see if I can get my cursor anywhere near it. Okay, here we go. So these look like louping ill particles, so louping ill virus. So to the sheep's immune system, that is louping ill, but it has no DNA inside. So the great thing about that is that the particle is not infectious, but the sheep's immune system thinks it's louping ill. So suddenly we've got a vaccine candidate which is safe to produce, doesn't involve live virus for the scientists, and therefore much easier, cheaper, and should give a better supply to the farmer. And on experimental trials, we have demonstrated that this vaccine is very effective at, first of all, raising the antibody response in sheep. So basically, if you vaccinate the sheep twice, the usual prime booster, as we did previously, you can see the orange lines. The sheep have a really good, strong response to that by producing antibodies, and the unvaccinated sheep along the bottom don't do this. But the really important thing is, can the vaccine stop the virus going into the brain of the animal? And basically, these graphs just show that, yes, it does. And this was work done by our pathologist, Dr. Joe Moore at Moredun, in that the unvaccinated sheep have all the brain lesions associated with louping ill, whereas the vaccinated sheep didn't. So, an effective research vaccine. This is happy days for Moredun. Normally, we would then just pass this on to a pharmaceutical company that showed interest. Sadly, when we tried to do that, because of the relatively small UK market for such a vaccine, that normal route was not possible. So we did actually spend quite a lot of time trying to get a partner this way until we met this very interesting company called Cairn Farm, quite a young company, very ambitious and thinking very differently about how we produce vaccines to the livestock market. And they were interested in helping us drive this commercialisation forward. So that was a real big green light moment for us. And with Cairn Farm's expertise in the commercial development that we wouldn't necessarily have at Moredun, that has been a real game changer for allowing us to proceed. So along with Cairn Farm, we put together a vaccine development plan in a 3-phase approach, and this was generally fitting in with the development of the vaccine. So I'll go over this quite quickly, but there is a brochure that you can refer to that's on our website, and that'll give you more details. But essentially, phase 1 is manufacturing transfer, taking the vaccine from a research vaccine in the lab into a large-scale commercial system. Lot of work, lot of testing, lot of difficulties involved in this. And that is sort of the first phase, taking about 9 months once we start, and about £720,000 to complete it. Phase 2 is very much all about regulations. So these yellow spacemen you see in the picture there are actually some of our scientists going into our high security unit. For this vaccine to be licensed, the Veterinary Medicines Directorate require a really strict safety and efficacy dossier. So results from studies of, again, vaccinating the sheep with now the commercial vaccine, and then moving on to challenging with Louping Ill virus. So we need all these safety things in place. This is an expensive one because of the trials, 1.5 million and about 16 months to complete. And then we move on to phase 3, which is all about the commercial manufacture. So the phase 3 is really an investment phase, a lot of money required, but that gets the vaccine into the sizes of batches we need to get it to the veterinary practices and able for the farmers to use it. So that's a very quick run through the 3 phases. Phases 1 and 2 are very much fundraising phases by donation. I'm sure you've all seen it by now. I hope you have. Or if not, I expect you to go and look at it now. And huge thanks to the NSA for supporting this. You can donate through their website, through the Moredun website. We're appealing to the farming industries, but we're also appealing to the moorland industries. You remember I said this is also an issue in red grouse. So we've had a massive help from Scottish Land and Estates, the moorland associations and regional groups, and also Hugo Straker, who has been helping us get access to estate owners. And then, I say, phase 3, we're taking differently completely because we'll be forming a new company for that, and people will be allowed to invest in it. So the all-important stage, and I probably could have saved an awful lot of time just by going straight to this slide. So where are we now? We're rolling together phases 1 and 2 as donation phases. So we're looking at this total of 2.2 million to finish those phases. And in the bank, we already have £250,000, and that has allowed phase 1 to start. So the vaccine DNA is now with the manufacturing organisation, and they've started work on it. So as the money comes in, it's going straight back out on the vaccine to try and reduce the time till we have a vaccine to as short as possible. At our very famous wine reception at the Highland Show this year, Marie Goujon, our Cabinet Secretary from the Scottish Government, very kindly pledged 100,000 in match funding. We can obviously draw that down now, and we are in the process of doing that, which helps our total hugely. Some of the estate owners have been really generous in their donations, and some of them like to split that in 2. So we've got a further almost £200,000 of pledged funds, which will come in next January, April next year, and that will help keep the phase 2 work going. And then, of course, David's fantastic announcement today that we were awarded DEFRA funding for the vaccine project. And this is a massive thanks to David and the Dartmoor Hill Farm Project, who included us in this bid, and of course to DEFRA for helping out. Now, even my maths can deal with that as half of the donations fees done. So although this is superb, I mean, it's a great achievement, but we can't take our foot off the gas. We've got another £1 million to raise. So any help we can get for that is obviously very, very welcome. Can I just say quickly before I go, before Phil actually pulls a plug on me, we talked briefly about other species, but in cattle, and I'll try and get this to work, this is a cow recently that was diagnosed with Louping Ill, was actually euthanized just after this video that the farmer has given me permission to show. Very similar to sheep with the head tilt, banging her head off the gates, obviously a very sore head. She got very distressed after this. Obviously that's a massive loss to an upland farmer. And then just more recently, the dog conundrum has come online. Some of you have seen this already. This is a working Labrador from the Grampian area, and this poor dog was diagnosed with Louping Ill and sadly also lost her life. You'll see the awful trembling and that lack of coordination this dog has, very similar to what you see in sheep. And this dog actually had full acaricidal treatment on, so that's the big worry for us and something we're watching carefully. Also in equines, working collie dogs, and I should also say, please, also the farmers and people who work out of doors, please do check yourself for ticks. It's not only Lyme disease. Louping Ill is unusual in humans so far, but we are worried, as are the public health agencies, of the virus coming to the levels it's at. You know, will we start seeing human cases? We need to keep an eye on that. So please do protect yourself as far as you can against tick. And I think that's me at the end, Phil. So thank you all for listening, and thank you to NSA for putting this webinar on.
Great. Thanks very much, Beth. That's great. And you know, it just shows you, doesn't it, when we're always being challenged as an industry to do more. You know, it's this whole thing about multifunctionality. But as I said at the beginning, there are trade-offs, and you know, we're seeing through, I suppose, enhanced vegetation management. We're seeing increased tick numbers. We're also seeing that pressure on on trying to reduce and limit the amount of parasiticides that we're using as well. And so this whole thing about you know, One Health and stimulating immunity and good nutrition and good management, which is what David was talking about, and then you know, with that foundation, I suppose, of vaccinations or vaccines to underpin health of our sheep is really, really important. Great news on some of that fundraising. Well done to everyone who's involved, and great news, David, on that DEFRA funding coming in to really give us a boost. But as Beth indicated, you know, this is part of a wider fundraising initiative as well. The NSA is pleased to be able to say that we're able to give some funds towards this, and I think it's really important. That's mainly working through our regions, but you know, it's really, really important that the industry steps up and is being seen to contribute to this. You know, we've got funding from Scottish Government, some funding from DEFRA, some funding from you know, some landowners and some trusts and some of the field sports fraternity. But it's really important that the sheep industry itself, I think, steps up and contributes to this if we want to bring it to market. So thank you very much, everyone. If you can just put your cameras on for a moment. We're short of time, but we've got 3 questions. It'd be great to be able to deal with those. First of all, Ian, to you. Ian, one for you. The case study that you gave us at the outset, where you said I think you'd lost 70 out of a group of 400 sheep. Have you seen it on any other pasture areas of your farm, and any ideas on how it got to that specific pasture?
Fairly simple answer to that. We have been aware of louping ill, and very occasionally we have seen it on the farm here. The ground in question was literally across the dike, one stone wall between my fields, where I've hardly ever seen it, but have on rare occasions, and this area where we had that severe attack. I think red deer are implicated. They were coming down and grazing that pasture, and I suspect they are probably the vectors that brought it in. I do so sorry about that. The red deer are implicated. To me, it's still a mystery, to be honest, as to why we suddenly got such a high incidence in ground which I'd been grazing for the previous 3 or 4 seasons. We had seen it, but we not in anything like that level of attack. So I'm slightly mystified by it all. Can't really explain it. I'm really looking forward more now. How do I manage it? And really looking forward to getting hold of the vaccine, to be honest with you.
Great. Thanks, Ian. There's another question here around the distribution map that you showed, Caroline, I think, showed that there are tick problems in what was possibly the New Forest. Can we confirm that did relate to the New Forest? And I guess that also links with the slide that you showed, Beth, around the distribution of ticks as well. And I suppose in a way that links to the point that David was making as well, that as we see changes and sometimes pressures on our farming systems to move stock around to maybe you know, rest areas for certain times of the year, you know, we've got a lot more work to do yet in terms of understanding the length of natural immunity, and I suppose the spread of diseases as well around the country. So, you know, as we move, as we change our, you know, many long-established farming systems and grazing systems, I suppose we just need to stay aware of how the risks change as well, and how we manage those risks. And again, that vaccination, that understanding of and the availability of vaccines is going to be essential, I would think. So, Caroline and Beth.
Yeah, I can comment on the New Forest from work that we do in a sister project to Optic called Tick Solve. So that's focused on effects of woodland expansion and climate change on zoonotic disease risks. Together with UKHSA, we've been sampling inside the woodlands in the New Forest and the surrounding countryside. And we know that it's a hotspot for Lyme disease, and there's also tick-borne encephalitis virus being detected in ticks in that area and also in deer serosurveillance. What we haven't done is looked at the moorland and grassland in between the woodlands. So it's quite a mosaic, isn't it, of moorland and grassland and woodland, and the areas that are grazed by the sort of common grazing areas. So we haven't been taking that sort of One Health approach there with respect to livestock. So I can't really comment on levels of Louping Ill virus. I think UKHSA have been looking at anaplasma in ticks in that area and finding it reasonably commonly in the questing ticks. Yeah.
And Beth, before we come on to you as well, I mean, does this open up another broader question around, in a way, quarantining and biosecurity and quarantine treatments? As what level of risk is there from moving the Louping Ill virus around via sheep movements or livestock movements and then infecting another tick population somewhere?
Yeah, for sure, Phil. I think, for all tick-borne disease, it's like any other parasite. Biosecurity is absolutely critical here if you want not to import any disease. Ticks are much more difficult though, because obviously wildlife carry them, and those we can't control. And I think, increasing numbers of deer in quite a lot of upland areas, from what we're hearing, is potentially what's causing an issue. And reports back to on not only red deer, but also in roe deer carrying really high tick challenges. So it is difficult. So biosecurity, obviously, if we're looking at something like sheep scab, is much easier. I know it's not easy, but it's easier than ticks, which, will obviously be being carted around despite us. But even so, I still do think there is a big role to play in reducing tick movement by ensuring that stock that are moving, I think particularly from higher tick grounds into in-by fields, particularly even if it's on the same farm. And interesting, the UKHSE survey that Caroline was talking about on anaplasma and ticks, I was horrified to see it in Richmond Park in London in ticks. So I thought, what hope have we got, on most of our upland areas if they've got it in a park in London? So yeah, it's how we keep on top of all that, and it definitely requires a combination of all our industries working in tandem with each other to help reduce impact.
Yeah, and of course, we're not just improving our environments in our uplands, are we? We're always looking. People are being encouraged and incentivized to improve our environments or change our environments in lowland areas. Often changes that again probably result in increased opportunities for tick population. I think, David, that's something you've seen on Dartmoor with, this sort of creeping down the hill, if you like, down into in-by fields and lower ground farms.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think in the case that I was describing, that farm, that flock's never been up on the hill, but that farmer grazes a lot of cattle up on the common, and I wonder whether anaplasm might have moved with ticks coming back with cattle as an example, or it could have been, birds or anything else. So there is, I think, a halo effect, if you like, around these upland areas or these semi-natural vegetation areas. But deer, I think, are increasingly are spreading ticks, I think, within the environment, and likely to increase in number as sort of land use changes, probably.
Excellent. There was one. Sorry, Caroline.
I was just going to pick up on something Beth said and also David said. I think we might be seeing changes in habitat suitability, but also farmer perceptions of when to treat according to risk. So it's quite common from what we've found in Wales that farmers will treat their stock when they're moving them to somewhere that's perceived as high risk for ticks, like the hill, but not in the reverse. So if they're bringing sheep down off the hill to the in-by fields, and also when they're moving stock for winter grazing, those areas were often sort of away from areas that would be considered as high risk. So it might not be kind of on the radar that treating to sort of prevent moving ticks into a new area that in the past maybe that was okay, but changing habitat suitability, changing the climate is meaning that those tick populations are starting to establish and thrive. Yeah,
absolutely. And if I could just make a plug here too for vets and postmortems and the VI centres, because it's tough enough, isn't it, when we lose sheep and they die, but actually if there's any value to a dead sheep is understanding what it's died from, isn't it, so that we can learn to avoid, hopefully to avoid similar situations in the year. So for farmers to be working with their vets and others to try to understand and know what's going on is really, really important. That surveillance and monitoring is really, really important. Good. Okay. Well, look, we've overrun. It's 1:15, so we've overrun by a few minutes. But I think there's been some fascinating presentations and case studies as well. It's a really important subject, this, and I think it is a subject that is going to. We're going to have to keep a really close eye on in the future. With, again, people have said climate change and changing habitats and changing livestock trends as well. So, I'm sure that ourselves at the National Sheep Association and the Moredun and everyone else involved on today's webinar will continue to work in this area, and we'll work together to keep people updated and informed as well. Again, just a final plea that if anyone does feel that they're able to go to the Moredun crowdfunding page and just contribute, it's it's financially it's important, but morally it's really important as well to be seen to support the development of this vaccine. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope it's been a useful webinar. Thanks very much for all of our presenters, and wish you the rest of a good day. Thank you.